So you know that in JavaScript, objects and arrays are reference types and they're mutable. Now, if you're using the unpush strategy, you want to make sure that you're working with immutable objects. And for that reason, Facebook team have created this library, Immutable.js, which you can find on facebook.github.io/immutable-js. So this library provides many immutable data structures like list, stack, map, and so on. In this lecture, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Immutable.js and how to use it in an Angular app, but you really need to look at the documentation to see the full list of classes and methods available in this library. So first of all, we install Immutable using npm. Now in app component, I'm going to import map and list from Immutable module. And then in the constructor, let's see how we can use immutable maps and lists. So let's say we have a movie object like this. Movie with title and genre. This is a plain JavaScript object. Now we can make this immutable by using the map function that we imported from Immutable module. So we can either give it this movie object here, and this is useful when you're getting objects from the server. For example, you may call your API endpoint, get an object, and then you can pass it to this map function to get an immutable object. Alternatively, you can create the object here. Exactly the same code. So this returns an immutable object. Let's call it movie. Now I'm going to log this on the console first. All right, look, this is our map object. So this does not have the structure of a regular JavaScript object. Here we don't have the title and genre properties. If you want to read a property, we use the get method. So movie.get and pass the property name here, title. Similarly, if you want to set a property, we use the set method. So movie.set title, and we give the new title here. Now, because this movie object is immutable, this set method is going to return a new object. So the original object is not modified. This is exactly like how we work with strings in JavaScript. So then we can reset the movie like this. Now, one problem that we have with this API is the use of these magic strings. These magic strings are fragile because we can make a typo, or we may decide to rename one of these properties, like title, to something else. The second problem with this API is that our code is a little bit more verbose. When we work with plain JavaScript objects, we can easily read a property like this. Or we can set it like this. And this is shorter and cleaner than using the API in Immutable.js. So what I want you to take away from this lecture is to use the Immutable.js library and the unpush strategy only in parts of your application that make sense, where you have performance bottlenecks that you discover after profiling, as opposed to imagining that this is going to be a performance problem right from the get-go and immediately apply the unpush strategy and use immutable objects. Don't treat this as a hard and fast rule. So this is how we get and set properties. There is another useful method you might be interested in, and that is movie.toJS. And this returns a plain JavaScript object. So let's log it in the console. And here's our movie object. Now, working with lists is very similar. So let's say we have a list of movies. Now here I'm just using numbers. We could have complex objects. It doesn't really matter. We can get an immutable list from this array by calling the list function and passing this movies array. And this approach is useful when you're getting your objects from the server, or you can declare your array here. And this returns an immutable list. Now, all methods we have to work with arrays in JavaScript are also available here. So here we have our push method. The difference is that instead of modifying this original list, it returns a new list. So we can reset our list like this. So this is the basic idea. Now I leave it up to you to look at the documentation when you need it. So before we finish this lecture, let's modify our code here and use immutable objects. So let's delete this constructor. Here we have an array of movie objects. I want these movie objects to be immutable because I'm passing them to movie component which expects immutable objects. So we can simply call the map function here to get an immutable object. And one more time, and the last time. Now let's imagine each of these movie objects has 10 other properties. For simplicity, I'm just going to add one extra property here, genre. Now in our click handler, I told you that we don't want to repeat all these properties here when resetting the first movie. We want to create a copy of that movie object with updated properties. How do we do that? Well, first, let's get a reference to this movie object. This movie object is not a plain JavaScript object, it's a map as defined in Immutable library. So we can call the set method to change its title property. And this will return a new immutable object with all existing properties and the updated title. And then we can use this to reset the first movie in our array. So this, that movie is of 0, we set it to this object. Now, because our movie objects are not plain JavaScript objects anymore, we should also go to the template for movie component. Remember, we cannot access the title property like this anymore. We have to call the get method and pass the name of our target property. And that's why I don't quite like this, because this is a little bit more verbose and we run into risk of using magic strings. But again, if you're building a performance critical application and we're suffering from performance issues because of a lot of comparison checks, we can use onPush strategy with immutable objects. Now, let's test the result. So back here, I'm going to click this button and the title of the first movie got updated.